A new beginning and an unexpected welcome. The return to Willowbrook. The sun had just begun its slow ascent over the quiet town of Willowbrook, casting golden streaks of light across the sleepy suburban streets. It had been years since I last called this place home. The familiar scent of morning dew, mixed with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee from nearby houses, made my return feel almost surreal. I pulled my black Ford Explorer into the driveway of 112 Elmwood Drive, the house I had just bought. A house that represented more than just four walls and a roof. It was a fresh start, a homecoming. But most importantly, it was my quiet refuge after a decade of service in law enforcement, countless nights spent chasing criminals, and too many days away from my family. Little did I know that this peaceful return would soon turn into a battleground of power, prejudice, and injustice. The first encounter with the HOA Queen. I had barely stepped out of my SUV when I heard it. A sharp, disapproving voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. "Excuse me, you can't park here." I turned to see a woman in her late 50s, dressed in an immaculately pressed blazer, standing with her arms folded across her chest. Her expression was one of thinly veiled contempt, the type of look someone gives when they believe they are superior. I offered a polite smile. "Good morning. I actually live here. Just moving in today." Her expression didn't change. "You must be mistaken. The HOA has not approved any new residents on Elmwood Drive. Who did you buy this house from?" The tone in her voice set off alarms in my head. Not the kind that signaled danger, but the kind that told me I was about to deal with trouble wrapped in authority. I extended my hand. "Name's Daniel Carter. Just closed on this house last week." She ignored my handshake, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I'm Patricia Langley, president of the Willowbrook Homeowners Association. You should have contacted me before making any changes to the property." Changes? I hadn't even unpacked a single box yet. "I don't believe I've made any changes, just moving in." She sniffed, looking at my SUV again. "Well, first of all, your vehicle is violating the HOA's parking policy. No large utility vehicles in the driveway. Secondly, I'll need to see proof of ownership." I raised an eyebrow. "Proof of ownership?" "Yes, before we allow a new resident to settle, we conduct an HOA approval process. No one moves in without our authorization." Now I was starting to understand. This wasn't just about rules. This was about control. A town built on prejudice and power. Growing up in Willowbrook, I remembered it being a tight-knit, middle-class community where kids rode their bikes until the streetlights flickered on and neighbors held barbecues in their front yards. But as I looked around now, things felt different. The perfectly manicured lawns, the identical mailboxes, the neatly paved sidewalks. It all seemed meticulously controlled. There was no room for anything out of the ordinary, and judging by Patricia's reaction, I was something out of the ordinary. I took a deep breath. "Ms. Langley, I respect that you have rules, but I'm not here to cause trouble. I legally own this house, and I plan on living here peacefully." Her eyes narrowed. "That remains to be seen." With that, she turned on her heels and marched away, but I could feel it. This wasn't over. The warning. That evening, as I was unpacking boxes, I heard a sharp knock on my door. When I opened it, I found a tall, thin man in his 60s standing there, his expression sympathetic but cautious. He had the look of someone who had something to say but was afraid to say it. "Evening," he said, shifting on his feet. "I'm Tom Harris. Been living here for 20 years. Thought I'd come by and introduce myself." I shook his hand. "Nice to meet you, Tom. Good to have a friendly face around here." He hesitated before speaking again. "Listen, I saw Patricia talking to you this morning. Just wanted to give you a little advice." I folded my arms. "I'm listening." He sighed. "Patricia, she runs this HOA like it's her personal kingdom. If she doesn't like you, she'll find a way to make your life miserable. She's had people fined, harassed, even forced out of their homes." I frowned. "That bad?" He nodded. I've seen it happen. And you don't exactly fit the mold of what she wants in this neighborhood. I smirked. And what mold is that? He hesitated again before lowering his voice. You're young. You drive a police SUV. And if I'm not mistaken, you're in law enforcement, aren't you? I studied him for a moment before answering. Yeah, I served as a detective for 10 years. Just took a new position here in Willowbrook. His eyes widened slightly. You're the new police chief. I nodded. Tom let out a low whistle. Oh boy. Patricia is in for a surprise. The power play begins. The next morning, I woke up to a bright orange violation notice stuck to my front door. Par KNG violation. Your vehicle does not comply with HOA regulations. Failure to comply will result in daily fines. I chuckled. She didn't waste any time. As I walked out to my driveway, I saw Patricia standing across the street, arms folded, watching me. A smirk played at the corners of her lips. I smiled right back. I had dealt with criminals, corrupt politicians, and some of the worst people imaginable in my career. If Patricia thought she could intimidate me with a piece of paper, she was in for a rude awakening. This was just the beginning. Patricia's power move and the HOA's dirty secrets expose. The morning sun was barely peeking over the rooftops when I stepped onto my porch, coffee in hand, and looked down at the bright orange violation notice still fluttering in the morning breeze. Par KNG violation. Your vehicle does not comply with HOA regulations. Failure to comply will result in daily fines. I had seen power plays before. Corrupt officials, criminals who thought they were untouchable, and people who let their titles go to their heads. But this was something else. I folded the notice and tucked it into my back pocket, shaking my head. Patricia Langley had just declared war. I took a deep breath. If she wanted to play games, I'd play along. What she didn't know, I never lost. The battle begins. I knew I had to get ahead of whatever she was planning next, so I took my first step, gathering intelligence. After finishing my coffee, I walked over to my next-door neighbor, Tom Harris, the same man who had warned me about Patricia's iron grip on the neighborhood. He was watering his plants, his face tight with concern as I approached. Morning, Tom. He set down his watering can and sighed. Morning, Chief. I see Patricia's already at it. I smirked. Yeah, figured I'd check in with you. How bad are these HOA fines? Really? Tom leaned on his fence. Bad? You have no idea. She starts small. Petty fines, warnings. But if you push back, she goes for the kill. People have lost thousands trying to fight her. And some, they'd lost their homes. I narrowed my eyes. Lost their homes. He nodded gravely. She finds ways to rack up penalties, and if homeowners can't pay, she takes legal action. I've seen families evicted over unpaid HOA dues. It's a racket. That settled it. This was bigger than just a power-hungry HOA president. This was organized abuse of power. And if there was one thing I hated more than injustice, it was the people who profited from it. An unlikely ally. That afternoon, I took a drive around the neighborhood. If Patricia had been running this scam for years, there had to be paper trails, records, something that would expose her. And I knew exactly where to start. I pulled up in front of a small real estate office at the edge of town. The sign read, Willowbrook Property Management. Inside, a young woman sat at the front desk, typing furiously. She glanced up when I walked in, her expression polite but tired. Can I help you? I flashed a friendly smile. I hope so. My name's Daniel Carter. I just moved into Elmwood Drive. Her eyes widened slightly. Oh, you're the one Patricia's been talking about. I raised an eyebrow. That didn't take long. She sighed. She called this morning. Wanted to verify your ownership. Claimed there might have been a mix-up with the sale. I clenched my jaw. She was already trying to challenge my right to live there. And what did you tell her? The woman hesitated, then lowered her voice. I told her the sale was legal and final, but I'm going to be honest with you. She's not going to stop. I leaned in. Do you know how many homes she's done this to? She looked around, then whispered, too many. I don't have proof, but I've seen people come in here crying, saying they were tricked into foreclosure. Bingo. I slid my card across the desk. If you ever want to talk, give me a call. She hesitated for a second, then took the card. Be careful, Mr. Carter. Patricia doesn't like to lose. I smiled. Neither do I. The HOA meeting showdown. That evening, I decided to face Patricia head-on. I knew the HOA had a monthly meeting, and it just so happened to be tonight. I arrived at the community center, a small brick building at the edge of the neighborhood, and walked inside. The room was filled with tense energy. Homeowners sat in rows of metal chairs, and at the front, Patricia stood behind a wooden podium. Her eyes narrowed the second she saw me. Ah, Mr. Carter, you're just in time. I folded my arms, giving her a polite nod. Wouldn't miss it. She cleared her throat and turned back to the room. Let's begin. First order of business. Compliance violations. A large projector screen flashed to life, displaying a list of homeowners with pending fines. My name was already at the top. I almost laughed. She didn't waste any time. Mr. Carter, she said, her voice syrupy sweet, you've already accumulated 2 violations, one for unauthorized parking and another for failure to submit your residency application to the HOA. We will need immediate compliance. I stepped forward, keeping my tone calm. I appreciate the concern, Patricia, but I don't recall signing a contract that gives the HOA authority over my private property. Murmurs rippled through the room. Patricia's smile faltered for half a second before she regained her composure. When you moved in, you became part of this community. The rules apply to everyone. I took a slow breath. And what happens if someone can't afford to pay these so-called fines? She tilted her head. Then legal action is taken. That was it. That was her entire game. I pulled out a thick manila folder from my bag and let it drop onto the podium with a thud. Interesting, because I did some digging, Patricia. And what I found? Let's just say you've been quite busy. She blinked. Excuse me. I opened the folder, revealing stacks of reports, complaints, and legal filings. Over the last 5 years, this HOA has fined over 30 homeowners into foreclosure. And where did those homes go? Oh, that's right. Back to the HOA's approved buyers. The room went dead silent. I glanced around. How many of you in this room have paid mystery fines that seem to appear out of nowhere? Hands slowly started going up. Patricia's face turned pale. This is slander. I took out one final document. A lawsuit. I also spoke to a lawyer. Turns out, HOAs have legal limits. And you crossed them. This community has been bullied long enough. The room erupted. Homeowners whispering. Some even standing up and confronting Patricia directly. She grabbed the microphone, her voice shaking. This meeting is adjourned. But the damage was done. The people had seen the truth. And Patricia Langley, her empire was crumbling. The HOA fights back, and Patricia calls 911. The moment the HOA meeting exploded into chaos, I knew I had just lit a fire that wouldn't burn out anytime soon. Patricia's face was beet red, her hands gripping the podium like she was holding on for dear life. The people had seen the truth. But I also knew one thing. People like Patricia never go down without a fight. And I was right. Because the very next morning, she made her next move. And this time, she called the cops on me. The aftermath of the meeting. By the time I got back to my house that night, I could already feel the ripple effects of what had just happened. I saw neighbors whispering in clusters, some looking at me with hope, others with fear, like they weren't sure whether to believe that Patricia could actually be stopped. As I walked up my driveway, I spotted Tom Harris leaning against his porch railing, shaking his head with a grin. "You really did it," he muttered, chuckling under his breath. I smirked. "Only the beginning." Tom looked around, lowering his voice. "You might have the law on your side, but Patricia, she's been running this place like her own little empire for years. She won't just roll over." I nodded. "I'm counting on that." But even I wasn't prepared for just how far she would go. The phone call that changed everything. The next morning, I was on my porch, sipping coffee, when I saw it. A black sedan pulled up across the street. The driver, Patricia Langley. And she wasn't alone. She stepped out of the car, followed by two men in suits, lawyers by the look of them. I set down my coffee, standing up straight as they approached. "Daniel Carter," Patricia said, her voice dripping with forced politeness. "We need to talk." I raised an eyebrow. "Good morning to you too, Patricia. What's this about?" One of the lawyers, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit, stepped forward. "Mr. Carter, we represent the Willowbrook Homeowners Association. As of this morning, you are in violation of multiple HOA policies, and we are filing an official complaint against you." I folded my arms. "For what exactly?" Patricia smiled, smug. "Unauthorized residency, parking violations, failure to adhere to community standards, and harassing an HOA board member." I actually laughed out loud. "Harassment? You mean the public meeting where I exposed your illegal foreclosures?" The lawyer cleared his throat. "If you do not comply with HOA regulations, we will take legal action to have you removed from the community." I took a step forward, lowering my voice. "You might scare the other residents, Patricia, but me, I know exactly what you're doing, and I'm not going anywhere." Patricia's smile faltered. For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She turned on her heels, walking back toward the car. But then she did something I didn't expect. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911. When the police arrived, 10 minutes later, I heard the sirens. A black and white patrol car rolled up to my driveway, lights flashing. I stood there, arms crossed, as two officers stepped out. One of them, Officer Ramirez, recognized me immediately. "Chief Carter," he said, confusion flickering across his face. "What's going on?" Before I could answer, Patricia marched forward. "Officers, I need this man removed immediately. He is trespassing and refusing to comply with HOA orders." Ramirez frowned. "Wait, trespassing? He lives here." Patricia huffed. "He was never approved by the HOA. This property was not legally transferred. I want him arrested for criminal trespassing." I watched as Ramirez exchanged a look with his partner. Then, slowly, I pulled out my wallet and flipped it open, revealing my badge. "That's interesting, Patricia, because I'm not just a homeowner. I'm also the new chief of police." Dead silence. Patricia's face drained of color. "You're lying," she stammered, shaking her head. "There's no way." I calmly reached into my back pocket and pulled out a copy of my appointment letter, holding it up for the officers. Ramirez took it, scanned it, then turned back to Patricia. "Ma'am," he said, "I suggest you stop wasting police resources. Chief Carter is a legal resident of this home, and calling 911 on him under false pretenses is borderline filing a false report." Patricia's hands curled into fists. "This is outrageous. I demand you arrest him." Ramirez sighed, turning to me. "You want to press charges for harassment, Chief?" Patricia's eyes widened. "Do you what?" I looked at her for a long moment. Then I smiled. "No, not yet." Patricia staggered back, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to argue. But she knew. She had lost this battle. The fallout. After the cops left, the news spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. I could see residents peeking out of their windows, whispering, some even grinning as they realized what had just happened. And Patricia? She stormed back to her car, slamming the door and speeding off. I watched her go, shaking my head. She wasn't done yet. I knew that much. But now, the entire neighborhood knew who she really was. And the best part, I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was fighting for all of them. The HOA's hidden scandal, and the secret that could destroy Patricia for good. The sun had barely crept above the rooftops of Willowbrook when I opened my front door and found another violation notice taped to it. HOA final warning. Failure to comply with HOA regulations will result in legal action. I chuckled under my breath, shaking my head. Patricia just didn't know when to quit. After last night's 911 stunt, she should have realized she was fighting a losing battle. But no, instead, she was doubling down. And that was a mistake. Because this time, I was about to uncover the one secret that would destroy her entire operation. The first clue. I had spent most of my career in law enforcement following one golden rule. If someone is pushing this hard to intimidate and silence people, they're hiding something big. And Patricia, she was fighting like a cornered animal. Which meant there was something underneath all of this. Something that wasn't just about petty fines or HOA politics. Something darker. And I was going to find out exactly what it was. A whisper in the dark. I started my investigation with the homeowners who had already suffered under Patricia's reign. It wasn't hard. After what happened at the HOA meeting, people were finally willing to talk. I started with Tom Harris, my next-door neighbor, who had already warned me once before. When I knocked on his door, he opened it immediately, ushering me inside like he had been waiting for this moment. "You were right about her," he said, his voice low. "But I don't think you realize just how bad it is." I leaned against his kitchen counter. "Then tell me." Tom took a deep breath. "It's not just about fines, Daniel. People are losing their homes, but not just because of debt. There's a pattern." I narrowed my eyes. "What kind of pattern?" He pulled out a folder from his drawer, flipping through dozens of documents. Then he pointed to one name in particular. "Ever heard of a company called Langley Real Estate Holdings?" I froze. Langley. Patricia's last name. "You're telling me she owns a real estate company?" Tom nodded. "Not just any real estate company. A company that just so happens to buy the homes that get foreclosed under the HOA's authority." I stared at the papers. That was it. That was the missing piece. Patricia wasn't just finding people into foreclosure. She was taking their homes and flipping them for profit. It wasn't just abuse of power. It was a full-blown fraud operation. Digging deeper, now that I had a lead, I needed proof. So I did what I do best. I started digging. And let's just say, it didn't take long for me to find a smoking gun. I spent the next 48 hours going through public records, financial statements, and legal documents. And what I found? It was worse than I expected. The scheme, exposed. Patricia and the HOA would target specific homeowners, mostly retirees, single parents, and people who didn't have the resources to fight back. They would hit them with bogus fines, racking up violations, until they couldn't pay. Once the fines stacked high enough, the HOA would move to foreclose, forcing them out. And then, like clockwork, Langley Real Estate Holdings would swoop in and buy the house, dirt cheap. Then Patricia would resell the home at full market price, pocketing the profits. She had been running this scam for over a decade. And the worst part, no one had ever caught her. Until now. The confrontation. I knew Patricia wasn't going to go down quietly. But that didn't mean I was going to let her walk away. So I did what any good cop would do. I set a trap. I called for an emergency HOA meeting. And when Patricia walked into that room, I could tell from the look on her face that she had no idea what was coming. She strutted in, acting like she still had control, like she still owned this place. I let her get comfortable. Then I stood up, and I dropped the bomb. "Patricia, do you recognize this?" I said, holding up a folder full of legal documents. She frowned. "What is this?" I took a step forward. These are property records. They show that Langley Real Estate Holdings, a company owned by you, has purchased over 30 foreclosed homes in this neighborhood. Every single one of them was taken through an HOA foreclosure that you orchestrated. Murmurs erupted in the room. Homeowners gasped. Some stood up. Patricia went pale. That's a coincidence," she stammered. I shook my head. "No, it's not. Because I also have sworn statements from former homeowners, people you forced out with fraudulent fines." I turned to the crowd. "How many of you have been harassed with sudden HOA fines that didn't make sense?" Dozens of hands shot up. Patricia stepped back, shaking her head. "You can't prove anything." I smiled. "Actually, I can." I pulled out my phone and hit play. And the room filled with Patricia's own voice, from a phone call she made to her lawyer just hours before. "If we push the foreclosure through fast enough, we can list it under Langley Real Estate before anyone notices. The HOA will back it. They always do." A recording. Solid proof. Her eyes went wide. She knew it was over. I turned to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've already contacted the authorities. Patricia Langley is under investigation for fraud, illegal foreclosures, and racketeering." I locked eyes with her. "You're done, Patricia." And for the first time ever, she had nothing to say. The aftermath. Within 24 hours, Patricia was served with a warrant. Within a week, an official state investigation was launched into the HOA. And within a month, Patricia Langley was arrested. Her empire crumbled overnight. And the best part, the residents of Willowbrook took back their community. Final thoughts. Patricia thought she was untouchable. She thought she could bully people, intimidate them, and take everything from them without consequence. But in the end, justice always wins. And me. I had come here just looking for a home. But what I found? A neighborhood worth fighting for. And I wouldn't have it any other way. Life after the HOA's fall. The neighborhood's fight for justice. The day Patricia Langley was arrested, Willowbrook changed forever. For years, she had ruled this neighborhood with an iron grip, manipulating the HOA laws, extorting residents, and destroying lives, all for personal gain. But now, she was sitting in a cold jail cell, her once unshakable empire collapsing around her. And yet, our battle wasn't over. Because while she was gone, the damage she left behind still remained. And now, it was time to rebuild. The fallout. And the fight for change. The morning after Patricia's arrest, I walked out onto my porch, expecting the usual sight of my neighborhood. Quiet streets, neatly trimmed lawns, the occasional jogger. But today, it felt different. The air was lighter. The tension that had hung over Willowbrook for years was finally gone. I saw neighbors standing outside in small groups, talking freely, something they hadn't done in a long time. For the first time, I saw people smiling, laughing, shaking hands. The fear was gone. But now, we had work to do. I had spent the last few days working with the state attorney's office, handing over every document, every phone call, and every financial record that proved Patricia's corruption. And the more we uncovered, the worse it got. Over 30 families had been illegally evicted over the past decade. The HOA's financial records showed that Patricia had been embezzling money for years. Several former board members had also been involved in the fraud, receiving kickbacks for every house the HOA took back. This wasn't just corruption. It was organized crime. And I was going to make sure they all paid for it. The town hall meeting, taking back our neighborhood. A week later, the entire neighborhood gathered in the community center for an emergency town hall meeting. For the first time in years, Patricia wasn't there to control the room. Instead, I stood at the front, alongside state officials and investigators, ready to answer the one question on everyone's minds. What happens next? A woman in the front row raised her hand. Is the HOA still in charge? I looked at the state attorney, who nodded at me. As of today, no, I said. The HOA has been officially dissolved. The room erupted into cheers. For so long, this corrupt system had ruled over them, dictated their lives, stolen their homes. And now, they were free. But not everyone was celebrating. One man in the back row stood up, his expression dark. That's great, but what about the people who already lost their homes? Are they just supposed to accept it and move on? I took a deep breath. No, I said. They're getting their homes back. The room went silent. I turned to the state attorney, who stepped forward and addressed the crowd. Every single foreclosure that took place under Patricia's HOA leadership is now under review, if it was done illegally. And from what we've seen, they all were. Those families will be given the option to return to their homes. Gasps, tears, hope. For the first time, these people weren't just hearing empty promises. They were seeing justice, a community reborn. Over the next few months, everything changed. The families who had lost their homes were given the option to move back in. The stolen HOA funds were recovered and returned to the community. The corrupt board members who worked with Patricia were all arrested. And as for Patricia, she was facing multiple felony charges, including fraud, embezzlement, and racketeering. She wasn't getting out anytime soon. But the best part, for the first time in years, this neighborhood belonged to the people again. I watched as neighbors started talking to each other again, helping each other. Barbecues started happening again. Kids started riding their bikes in the streets without their parents worrying about some ridiculous HOA rule banning sidewalk chalk. The fear was gone, and in its place, something even stronger. Community. One last encounter. A few weeks later, I got a phone call from the county jail. "She wants to see you," the officer said. I knew exactly who they meant, and part of me wanted to ignore it. But another part of me wanted to look Patricia in the eyes one last time. So, I went. I walked into the visitor's room, where she was already sitting behind the glass, dressed in an orange jumpsuit, her once perfectly pressed blazer now replaced with a prison uniform. She looked smaller, like the weight of what she had done had finally caught up with her. She picked up the phone, and I did the same. "You think you won," she said, her voice hoarse. I tilted my head. "I don't think. I know." She let out a bitter laugh. "Do you really think they'll thank you for this? The people in that neighborhood. Do you really think they needed saving?" I leaned forward. "I don't care if they thank me or not. I didn't do this for gratitude. I did it because it was right." She scoffed. "You don't belong there, Carter. You never did." I smiled. "Maybe not. But at least now, that neighborhood belongs to the people, not you." She stared at me for a long time, her hands clenching into fists. But she had nothing left to say. Because we both knew the truth. I had won, and she had lost. For good. The journey to hope, and the legacy that remained. I walked out of that jail feeling lighter than I had in months. Because for the first time in a long time, I knew I had made a difference. And maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just about winning a battle. It was about proving that when people stand up for what's right, when they refuse to back down in the face of corruption, they win. Every single time. A new chapter, and the unexpected twist that changed everything. The battle was over. Patricia Langley was in prison, her iron grip over Willowbrook shattered. The HOA, once a tool of fear and corruption, had been dissolved. Families who had been forced from their homes were moving back in, rebuilding the lives they had thought were lost forever. For the first time in years, there was no fear, no intimidation, no impossible fines forcing people to choose between keeping their homes and putting food on the table. This should have been the end of the story. But life has a way of throwing in one last twist. And this one changed everything. One last goodbye. After months of fighting, I finally felt like I could breathe again. I had come to Willowbrook looking for a fresh start, a place where I could finally settle down, away from the chaos of law enforcement. But instead, I had walked straight into a battlefield. Now that it was over, I thought maybe, just maybe, I could finally enjoy the peace I had fought for. So one quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, I stood outside on my porch, watching as kids played in the streets and neighbors gathered for small talk. It was the kind of simple happiness that had been missing for so long. I should have felt relieved. But instead, I felt something else. Restless. Like something wasn't quite finished. And then, the phone rang. An unexpected visitor. I didn't recognize the number. But the moment I answered, I recognized the voice. "We need to talk." I frowned. "Who is this?" A pause. Then, "Tom Harris." I glanced across the street toward his house. The lights were on, but something felt off. "Meet me at the old community center," he said. "Now." Then the line went dead. Something about the urgency in his voice made my stomach tighten. Something was wrong. The final secret. I pulled into the abandoned parking lot of the old community center, the place where I had confronted Patricia for the first time. Tom was already there, standing near the steps, his face pale and tense. "Tom," I said, stepping out of my car. "What's going on?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out a folder and shoved it into my hands. "I thought we had seen it all, Daniel. I thought when Patricia was arrested, we had uncovered everything. But we didn't." I flipped open the folder and scanned the first page. Then my breath caught in my throat. Because staring back at me were financial records, not from Patricia, but from someone else. Someone still living in Willowbrook. Someone who had been pulling strings behind the scenes the entire time. I flipped to the next page. And that's when I saw the name. A name that made everything click into place. A name that made me realize the fight wasn't over. The real mastermind. Joseph Callahan, the former vice president of the HOA. A man who had always kept to the background, never making himself a target like Patricia had. A man who, on the surface, seemed like just another resident. But in reality, he was the one who had built the entire scheme. Patricia had just been the face of it. She had enforced the rules. She had bullied and harassed people into leaving. But Joseph, he was the one who had designed the entire system. He had created fake fines, set up phony foreclosure auctions, and ensured that everything ran just under the radar. And now that Patricia was gone, he was still here, still free, still pulling the strings. The final confrontation. I wasn't going to let him walk away. So the next morning, I paid Joseph Callahan a visit. His house was a perfectly maintained 2-story home, the kind that screamed wealth and comfort. I knocked on the door. It took a few moments before he answered, his expression calm and composed. Too composed. Like he already knew why I was there. "Daniel," he said smoothly, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" I didn't bother with pleasantries. "Cut the act, Joseph. I know everything." His smile didn't falter. "Do you?" I pulled out the folder and handed it to him. "Your name is on every major financial transaction tied to the HOA. Patricia was just the attack dog. You were the real mastermind." He didn't even look at the papers. Instead, he sighed and leaned against the doorframe. "And what do you plan to do about it, Chief?" I took a step closer. "Oh, I don't plan. I already did." Joseph frowned. "Excuse me." I smiled. "While you were standing here acting like you had a way out of this, I already sent everything to the state attorney's office. You should be getting a visit soon." For the first time, his confidence cracked. His face turned pale. And then, the sound of sirens. Joseph's head snapped up as 2 unmarked black SUVs pulled into his driveway. I leaned in, lowering my voice. "Game over, Joseph." Moments later, federal agents stepped out, flashing badges. And just like that, he was done. A true victory. When Joseph Callahan was arrested, it marked the true end of the corruption that had plagued Willowbrook for years. He had thought he could outsmart everyone, thought he could slip away while Patricia took the fall.